And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Arway, here. She's going to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Marcus. So once again, my name is Arway Boker, and I am a Professional Development Manager here at NYLC. And just so we are all on the same page, this webinar is going to talk about creating and developing a Youth Advisory Council, integrating authentic youth voice in your organization. So again, just an introduction with myself, Arway Boker, and then Marcus Penny is going to be joining us just as a support for the GSN as well as support for the webinar platform. So again, if you have any questions, please send us an email or a chat message directly using your chat box, and we'll be sure to answer any questions as they come up. Feel free to ask any questions as you find them relevant, whether it's related to the technology or if you have a question about something that I'm saying. I'll be sure to keep an eye out on the chat box, see who's asking those questions, and provide answers as soon as I can. So as you may know, NYLC is based in Minnesota, and St. Paul in particular. Would love to hear where everyone else is from. Our screen is showing that we have 24 attendees currently. Just using the chat box or writing directly on the map, where is everyone calling in from? We have one participant joining us from Pennsylvania. Welcome. Denver, Colorado. Local Minneapolis. New Jersey, my home state. Love to hear from you. Another Minnesota, Iowa, New York, Missouri. The Midwest seems very strong. Alberta, Canada. I'll keep that in mind for the next time we use a wrap to include Northern American countries. And we have a few participants in from Virginia as well. So good representation from Mid and Eastern U.S. as well as Canada. Great to have you on. We'd love to hear some of your perspectives, some of your insights. Use that chat box as your way to communicate with the large group. And so we'll just go ahead and go right into the agenda. And so for the next couple of minutes, the goals that I have identified, I will share later. But the agenda for this afternoon is using that service learning model. We're going to identify the desired results related to developing Youth Advisory Council, determining accessible evidence, the student experience, and then self-assessment. And as you know, NYLC does focus on service learning. So if this is your first introduction to service learning, I will provide some brief overview about what that is and how we define service learning as an approach to teaching and learning in which students address genuine community needs. So just moving forward, again, if you have any specific questions around service learning and some of the terms that I may be using, please use that chat box and I can clarify any information that you may have. So these are our goals for this morning. Some of the goals that we'll be working on is just sharing strategies to authentically engage youth in your work using service learning as an approach. And then we'll also share some specific strategies that NYLC uses with our own Youth Advisory Council. We've had a Youth Advisory Council for over 30 years now. Our cohort this year is actually serving a 2-year term. So we did a recruitment process over the summer. Right now they've completed about 4 or 5 months of service. We've engaged them in multiple different facets of our work, from designing a national youth campaign to presenting on our behalf at local conferences. Right now they're doing a lot of preparation for our National Service Learning Conference in April. So great, a lot of great ways that we engage our Youth Advisory Council, and our goal for this webinar is to share some of the strategies, some of the tools that we use in hopes that it can also help you engage youth authentically within your organization. So at NYLC, we define service learning as an approach to teaching and learning in which students use academic knowledge and skills to address genuine community needs. And while some of you may have had experience with service learning in the classroom, we also use this approach when we work with our Youth Advisory Council members. It's going through this process of determining what it is that students are bringing into their membership while they're on the YAC that can help support the work that we're doing. So thinking about finding meaningful projects that the youth can work with, meaningful ways that they can contribute to some of the planning that we do as an organization, some of the larger decision making that we do as well. And using that framework of service learning is a way that we really gauge what works well, what hasn't worked well, what needs to be changed, and how we can best serve the needs of our youth, as well as accomplishing what we need to as an organization. So for that first step of service learning, it's identifying your desired results. So this is the period of the service learning pre-planning where you as the facilitator or perhaps you as the youth who's deciding whether or not you want to create or join a youth advisory council, this is what you're hoping to accomplish by doing so. So at the end of the service term, like what are you hoping that the students learn? That could be something academic. For example, if your council is a National Honor Society. It could be something related to civic responsibility if your council is supporting the organizational work within, let's say, your local legislative office. It could be character if your council is supporting the district work within your school. It could be leadership if your council is working with a nonprofit in developing and growing leadership skills for youth. So those are some specific results that that you as a facilitator or as a youth may want to accomplish prior to joining a youth advisory council. So our next question is actually going to gauge some examples of youth development as a foundation, a model, or a key construct that you use within your work with youth. I know for NYLC, for example, our focus for the foundation of our youth development is on positive youth development. So we focus a lot on the 5 C's. So thinking about character, caring, confidence, those are the focus of our work, and all of our work is really tied around that foundation. So everything that we do, whether it's working with our Youth Advisory Council or working with our youth board members, is ensuring that youth have an opportunity to develop in those areas. So using your chat box, or perhaps if you can write directly on the screen, what are some examples of youth development foundations that you currently use or are hoping to use with your work?
For anyone who wants to write, at least give a shot at writing right on the screen. If you can see, it should be at the top left in the menu. There's a T tool, a text tool. So if you click the T and then click anywhere on the screen, hopefully we're not writing on top of one another, but if you want to, you can give that a shot. Otherwise, the chat box is wide open for everyone as well.
So I know a few people may be typing, so I don't want to rush anybody. But so one example that I shared was that NYLC uses positive youth development as our strategy and as the basis of our youth development work. The question is, what are some examples of other models or key constructs that you use with your own programs? '21st century skills, that's a great one. Social emotional learning. And there's a YPAR, which I'm not familiar with. If you could use a chat box or write on the screen to explain what that is, just so I have a clear understanding of it. I'm seeing a lot of community-based initiatives, so thinking about those genuine community needs. So YPAR is Youth Participatory Action Research. Great, that's something new. I would love to hear more about that. Identity learning is one. And oftentimes, these key constructs would be what forms the organizational logic model that you're using. So also using that logic model as a reference to setting the foundation of the work that your youth council may be working on is a great tool, or a great approach, rather. Well, thank you, everyone, for sharing. So Once you've been able to establish what those desired results are for your Youth Advisory Council, it's really important that you get it on paper and it's shared not only with the organizational staff, but also with the youth so they know exactly what it is that you're hoping that they learn, and also you're setting the expectations of what you're hoping that they contribute while they're serving on your term. And so at NYLC, the approach that we use is this guiding ideals, expectations, and definitions. This is about a 7-page document, which we, again, share with our Youth Advisory Council members as well as with our staff, so they have a full understanding of what it is to be on an NYLC YAC member, to be on the NYLC YAC, to be a YAC member, and what our expectations for those YAC members are. In this document, we also include specific roles that staff would play. So we identify who the YAC advisor is, what are some responsibilities that involve being a YAC advisor. For the YAC in particular, we identify some of the roles that they play. So for example, we have chosen 2 YAC members to serve as YAC mentors. So within this document, we would outline what the expectations and the responsibilities are for a YAC member. And then also at NYLC, we use our YAC to serve in multiple committees within the organization. And so one committee would be the CEO Cabinet Committee, which has 3 YAC members meeting directly with our CEO on a monthly basis to help support the work that she's doing, whether it's fundraising or grant writing or working with board initiatives. That committee is responsible for connecting and serving as that youth representation with the CEO. So this ideals, expectations, and definitions handout that we share with everyone would also include a brief description of the roles of that youth committee. In the past, we've had committees for social media team. We've had a committee for our National Service Learning Conference. So your document may change depending on the focus of the council for that year. So it's important that as you onboard a new group of youth, whether they've served with you before or not, that you update this document to reflect what work that they are going to be working on throughout their year of service. And then also another thing to establish prior to recruitment or prior to really beginning to serve with those youth is setting up those meeting dates so there's a clear expectation of how often, how frequently your youth advisory councils are going to meet. I know for our youth members, because we are a national organization, our YAC members serve in multiple roles at home. They're also engaged in employment opportunities. They're also engaged in extracurricular opportunities. So they have fairly busy schedules. And one of the ways that we ensure that we are all on the same page is by setting those meeting dates in advance so they know exactly when we're going to meet as a group and they can adjust their schedules accordingly. So that's an expectation that I think we as adults often hold for ourselves, and I think it's something that we can also encourage the youth to hold us responsible in that they know what meeting times are taking place, they know what the expectations are in terms of responsibilities, and you can use these documents to hold each other accountable throughout your service term. So that would conclude that first step of establishing a youth advisory council. So the second step is determining the acceptable evidence. So how are you going to measure the success of the group? And that could be having them complete a particular project, if that's the purpose of your youth advisory council. It could be developing particular character and leadership development skills. So it's important that prior to that service term, you also determine different ways that you're going to evaluate that process. And there are multiple ways that you can do this, including general discussions. You can have a post survey, which is often referred to as an exit slip as well. Or you can just have a checklist of activities that you want to engage your council in that you keep on hand as a record of what they've done. For example, some ways that we engage our youth is in the planning of our National Service Learning Conference. So our checklist, for example, might be that we have our Youth Advisory Council members present 2 workshops at this National Service Learning Conference. They apply to serve as a youth MC. They help support the on-site Service Learning Project Committee. Those are some examples of checklist items that will determine whether or not your your desired results are being achieved. So our next question is going to ask, what are some ways that you have used program evaluations or data management? And I know the previous slide did share some of those examples, including those discussions, thinking about the exit slips, the summaries. What are some other examples of program evaluations and data management? And again, feel free to write directly on the screen or in the chat box. So Roxanne has shared that she does post surveys, but using those journal ideas might be a great tool for her. I'm hearing that some have also used journal, depending on what the program is, and then also incorporating in those reflective activities. Focus groups are definitely a great way that you can engage with the youth members throughout their entire service term. Yep, so I'm hearing a lot of post-service surveys, using the iPod model as a journaling and survey option. Parent focus groups, that's definitely a good approach to seeing the impact that your program is having on the youth as well as their families. Great. So at NYLC, we do a combination of everything that, that you have all mentioned. We actually had an evaluation team which has done a pre and a post survey, which we found helpful before, and we pretty much just use a standard SurveyMonkey to track that information, but rely on connecting with the youth prior to their service as well as after their service to really gather that information and make those assessments accordingly. I'm hearing a lot of student surveys. And does anybody have any examples of some data management tools? So one tool I did just share is that SurveyMonkey as a data management tool. So Roxanne also uses SurveyMonkey. Efforts to outcomes. I'm not familiar with that, but I definitely will follow up with you, Doris. End of class surveys from participants? Absolutely. Yep. Yep, even just thinking about using Excel as a way to gather those pre and post survey results would be a great option. Yep. Google has a great online system that would allow you to gather that data and information. And then DYCD online, I'm not familiar with that, Tracy. I'll have to connect with you to get more information about it. Noble Hour was presented as an option. And then another system which I've used in the past is Youth Service Network. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but it's an online platform which actually does a combination of everything that has been referenced. So you can use it similar to Excel in that you can use it to track attendance. You can use it to create those surveys. You can use it to gather student demographics. And I know another one which I was recently just informed about is the Sprockets Network. I know it's something that Minnesota has been using for the past couple of years. I'm not sure if it's a national service, but Sprockets, like that Youth Service Network, is another online tool which gathers demographic information as well as pre- and post-survey information from participants. Great. Well, thank you again for sharing all this wonderful information and all these great tools. I definitely want to go back and learn more about some of these tools in hopes that we at NYLC can also better the systems and evaluation that we use. Thank you. And so that actually will conclude the second stage of that service learning process, so determining the acceptable evidence. How can you measure what's working well, what isn't working well, and make those changes accordingly? And so that next stage of the service learning process is that student activity. And for those of you who have completed service learning projects in the past, this is where you would see that IPART process. So IPART is an acronym which stands for Investigation, Planning and Preparation, Action, Reflection, and Demonstration. And I realize this slide is a bit wordy, so I do want to go into detail as to the information that I have available to you right now. So again, IPART is that investigation process where students will use to complete a service learning project. And then to the left of that slide, you'll see the 8 service learning standards which NYLC has identified as leading to quality practice for service learning. So meaningful service, linked to curriculum, reflection, diversity, youth voice, partnerships, progress monitoring, and duration and intensity. When we find that all of these 8 standards are included within a service learning project, we find that this really leads to true quality practice for multiple reasons. And so one thing that we focus on when we work with our youth is to ensure that we also reflect some of these standards within the practice that we do. And so I know in some of the evaluations you mentioned journaling. So journaling is a great tool of reflection that really allow those students to not only develop their ELA skills, but also to gather that information about the experience as a whole. So as you continue on to work with your Youth Advisory Council members, think about identifying projects that not only help the need that you have as an organization, but are also meaningful for students. So this third step of service learning is where you would do those student projects. And in relation to student councils and youth councils, these are some of the projects that you may ask your youth councils to complete. I did share prior to this step some of the ways that we engage our Youth Advisory Council members, and one of those ways is participating in our National Service Learning Conference. So at that conference, we have our Youth Advisory Council members lead workshops. In the past, they've led a Service Learning 101 workshop. They've led a workshop on partnerships, and they've also led a service learning workshop which focuses on closing the achievement gap. And for each of those workshops, our students went through this entire IPART process. So they went through that investigative stage to identify, well, what is the focus of the workshop? So for example, service learning. If it's a Service Learning 101, they went through that investigative stage with the help of NYLC facilitators to ensure, well, what are the crucial information that should be included within the Service Learning 101 workshop? That planning and preparation, because they are a national council, we rely solely on Google Docs to really help the students execute creating those agendas and those outlines. And then last April, they presented that service learning workshop at the conference. And following that conference, they had a debrief session where they reflected on the experience. They made edits for future YAC members to reference, as well as future NYLC staff to reference when we also present those service learning 101 workshops to our partners. And then as a form of demonstration, this is something that we really focus on at NYLC, is highlighting the work that the students have done. So not only were they recognized in our program guide, we highlighted their success on our social media pages. We've written nomination letters for them, whether it's for college recommendation letters or for local awards within their school communities or within their cities. Just highlighting the success and the work that the students have done in that planning is integral to not only their recognition of being valued for the input that they can provide for the organization, but also just demonstrating how we as an organization can use youth to accomplish our goals and hopefully encourage others to do the same. So that's one example of a project which our Youth Advisory Council members used following this IPART process. And again, there are multiple ways that you can engage youth in projects within your organizations. But if you think about those standards that NYLC has identified for quality practice, just ensuring that it's meaningful service, I think is an important aspect of engaging youth councils to avoid that idea of tokenizing youth just for the sake of saying we work with youth, but it's really not benefiting the youth who are completing these projects. So our next question is, what are some examples of meaningful projects that your youth can be involved in supporting? I shared one, which is that they presented workshops on behalf of NYLC at various conferences. And based on, depending on what the focus is within your organization, this may look very different. A student council, for example, one meaningful project that they could do would be engaging with the school board to share some student experiences if that's something that is of interest to them. So what are some examples of meaningful projects that your youth can be involved in supporting? And again, feel free to use that chat box or write directly on the wall. An anti-bullying campaign, yes, that is a great example of a project that your youth councils could focus on that is meaningful not only to them but for the organization. And so in the chat box, just for those of you who do not have access to the computer screen right now, I'm seeing our students are looking at watersheds, supporting the community, drug and alcohol prevention, free little library access, awareness events around sexual health, Choose Kind program and bullying, anti-bullying, I apologize, peer-to-peer college counseling, building community, seeing school gardens, leading other students in service experience, employment, internships, community service, philanthropy councils, and one of the youth committees review the grant to support local youth initiated projects. Yeah, so those are all great examples of ways that you can engage youth in meaningful projects within your councils. So just as a little courtesy reminder, when you have your youth doing projects within your councils, it's doing those things that not only support the work of your organization, but also are a great benefit to the youth. And again, NYLC did identify those standards, which will lead to quality practice, and I can share that link that'll take you directly to each of those standards, and it'll give you an option to explore them in detail, as well as watch some videos, download resources, PDFs that'll help you incorporate those standards within the work that you do. And the last comment that I'm seeing is just partnering with the University Ronald McDonald House in Philadelphia. Great projects, great use of student voice within your youth council. And so that fourth step of service learning is this self-assessment, where you document what worked, what didn't work, and then how can your service dig deeper. And part of this self-assessment may just be looking at your evaluation results, whether they were pre or post surveys, maybe you did journaling as an option, maybe you're looking at the change in your students' test scores. Just making an assessment of what works well throughout your project, throughout your service term, is a great way to make changes for the next council that you're working with. And so, as we mentioned before, I'm thinking about setting up your councils for success is really documenting all that information, documenting all the responsibilities, the meeting dates, who attended those meetings, who was absent, documenting the conversations that you've had with your students throughout that service term is a great way to also review that self-assessment aspect of service learning. And so another form of self-assessment, again, is you as a facilitator really just taking that time to review what worked well for you, what information was missing from you, what information could have aided the success of the work of your council, and then also thinking about how can you engage other staff within your organization to help support the work of those councils. For example, last year after our self-assessment with our Youth Advisory Council, we found that only 2 staff had ongoing relationship with our Youth Advisory Council members. We also found that some of the staff felt like they did not have an option to really engage with our council unless they were physically um, on site, whether it's at our office in Minnesota or at the National Service Learning Conference. And so as that self-assessment, one of the things that we did this year was just using that iPod process, we created a NYLC YAC mentor model where staff can sign up to be a mentor to our Youth Advisory Council members, and YAC could sign up to be mentored by our NYLC staff to help foster and create those opportunities for staff and YAC to have relationships outside of our annual service learning conference and outside of the annual fall retreats where the YAC are actually in Minnesota once a year. So that was one important self-assessment which I felt like our team made, and really reviewing the entire service process that our YAC had. And then for this term, we made that adjustment to allow for more opportunities for staff and YAC to engage. So self-assessment is very important to thinking about how you can make those adjustments throughout your service term throughout the service term, but also just bettering the future service terms that you have with your Youth Advisory Council members. And then one thing that I do not want to exclude, and I also don't want to assume that we are all following the same practices, is talking about these protocols. So again, most youth are under the age of 18. There are particular protocols that must be set in place. So one thing, thinking about parental permission slips, parental involvement forms, and that may be linking and sharing it back to whether those identified desired results of the service, and sharing that with parents, and having parents also commit to supporting their children throughout that service experience. So that's one example of a protocol that should be in place when you're working with youth. Are there any other examples that you would like to share? And again, feel free to use that chat box as well as write directly on that wall. Some protocols that we use when we work with youth, whether it's in a service council or with youth within your schools. Yes, community volunteers must pass background checks, absolutely. And there are various background checks that you could that your volunteers could take, whether it's state or federal. Signing those youth agreements, yes. So not only sharing the overview of your council in advance, but having students sign off as having read, reviewed, and being committed to what you're asking them to sign up for. Yes, group contacts, whether it's independent, the application process and interviews. And I'm also seeing having opportunities for students to share, ask questions, get updates, identifying the history of local schools, media releases. Yep, so if your site has an online social media presence, you would need those media release for your youth to post pictures on your site as well as your website. Photo releases. Absolutely. And so in order for you to get some of this information, which you may or may not already have hand, just doing a simple Google search is a great way to get media releases. You can also contact some school representatives who already have that information available, and use that as a reference for use when you're creating your own for your specific council's needs. So just ensuring that you've covered all the protocol requests, whether you're working in a CBO or in a school or in a national nonprofit organization, ensuring that all the protocols are covered that protect the rights as well, the rights of the youth that you're working with. And again, just thinking about how you can engage parents in those conversations and having parents also commit to supporting their youth throughout their service term. Again, thank you everyone for your suggestions. This PowerPoint will be available, so all the suggestions that were presented today, you'll have access to them for reference following this webinar. And so that concludes the aspect of using service learning as an approach to develop a youth advisory council. And again, there are multiple questions regarding forming a council. And I know depending on how long you may have worked with your council, whether you're starting a new one or are trying to authentically integrate youth voice within your council, please just follow that service learning approach to teaching and learning, where you recognize the skills and the knowledge that the students are bringing to your organization and find ways for them to use those skills and address genuine needs within your organization or the community in which they're serving. Does anyone have any specific questions regarding youth councils that you feel like you wanted to have answered that I may have not presented or addressed during this webinar? This will be a great time to hear from everyone. And I realize that people might be typing out their questions, so I will give it some time. All right, so it seems that Tony has a question about how to select students. So I can share how NYLC selected our Youth Advisory Council members, and no, it is not redundant. So this year, we pulled our Youth Advisory Council members from students who were engaged with NYLC in some form in the past. So perhaps they attended our 7-day NYLT training over the summer. Perhaps they attended a 3-day workshop at their school, or maybe they were engaged in NYLC through our Generator School Network, which is our online service learning community. Those were some of the qualifications that we had for recruitment for our Youth Advisory Council members. And in the beginning of June or July, I can't remember the exact date, we released a application which had them complete a few essay questions, as well as, again, signing those waivers to agreeing to commit to the requirements to be a YAC member, whether it's meeting those monthly meetings, attending those monthly meetings on Sunday, attending our National Service Learning Conference next year. Those are some of the basic requirements. And so in our application, we had that available to the youth. And I know someone had mentioned earlier using Google as a way to track that survey and those assessments. We also provided our application online using a Google Doc. And so once the students completed that application, we had 2 group interviews because we are a national organization and our students do not meet in face-to-face very often. We wanted to replicate the similar experience that they would go through throughout their service term. So we did that through the group interview using the same format that we use for our webinars, which is this WebEx platform. And students went through a standard YAC monthly meeting where we as an organization would present bullets, have them lead some of the activities, provide suggestions, engage in conversations via this webinar platform to ensure that they were comfortable doing so, but also give them an opportunity to experience what it would be like to serve on our council since we don't meet face-to-face, and decide whether that's something that they would enjoy doing. And then following those group interviews, we narrowed down our selection to a handful of youth who received an individual interview by our selection committee. And our selection committee at NYLC was comprised of 1 representative from each department. to ensure that all perspectives of the organization were represented. So, for example, we had a representative from our Youth Initiatives Department, our Conference and Events team, our Human Resources team, as well as our Fund Development team. And so each representative received the students' applications, they reviewed them, they scored them, and then we interviewed a handful of youth based on what they submitted on their application. And then following those individual interviews, we sent out notice of whether or not they were invited to join or were not invited to serve on our council. So, Tony, I hope that answers your question regarding recruitment. That's an example of what we did. And, yes, we did use a rubric for our evaluation of our applications. And I can share that with you, Tony, if that's something that you're interested in perhaps using for your group. And our rubric was really a way to ensure that we're looking for the same information and the same skills within our youth. Again, some of the youth we had met before, some of the youth we did not have any experience with them. So an example of our rubric would be if we needed to, let's say public speaking was an important skill that we needed on our council. A one would be perhaps the youth identified interest in wanting to develop their public speaking skills. A two would be perhaps the youth had presented at one event around public speaking. And then a four would be perhaps the youth had presented at multiple engagements around public speaking and had spoke to an audience of over 1,000 people. So that's an example of how we use those rubrics, but then in the conversations we identified what the group needed or what was missing based on the information that we gathered from the rubric. And so I'm hearing that a few people would like to see the NYLC rubric that we use to grade our student applications, and I will gladly share those with you on the GSN following the webinar. And then the next question, do we encourage term limits? So in the past, we did not have a term limit for our youth. This is something that we put into place recently. So right now, our term limits are 2 terms. And again, in the past, our youth served a term of 1 year. This year, they are asked to serve a term of 2 years. And the reason why we made that change from 1 to 2 is based on what we're asking our youth advisory councils to accomplish this year. So one of their big tasks and one of their big projects is to create a youth campaign. And so part of knowing the work and the history and the amount of time it takes to plan a campaign, we wanted them to also be able to not only go through that process of planning it, but also present it to the larger audience and continue to support the youth who sign up to support this campaign. So that was one reason why we decided to extend our term from 1 to 2. So depending on what your focus is for your youth to accomplish during that service term, I would definitely encourage you to make those adjustments as your organization sees fit. And our age range for our Youth Advisory Council members is between the ages of 14 to 21. So that's another reason why we set those term limits, to ensure that those students who are at the higher end of the age requirements are given other opportunities to benefit and to serve NYLC other than joining the YAC. Okay. And then, so Ashley, your question was to touch on potential pros and cons of providing incentives to youth that participate. I think, and this is something that I've been asked before, not only thinking about youth councils, but just service learning projects in general. I think for us as a national organization, just being a national organization is one of the incentives that our youth have for joining our council. So while it may not be something that we encourage, I think just highlighting the differences and highlighting the uniqueness of your organization is important, not only to help the youth identify and make those comparisons behind their own personal interests, but also just ensuring that they can speak to what your organization does by identifying its uniqueness. So if you were thinking along the lines of those types of incentives, some youth also need that help in understanding or making that larger connection to what the benefits of joining a YAC can do for them professionally as well as for their education. So I think it's important that you do share some of the benefits of joining a Youth Advisory Council member so that you are all on the same page when you're working towards the work that you do with your organization. And then in terms of the cons, I think one of the challenges that we've had, again, as a national organization is that some youth do just want to join because they're interested in going to DC for a National Service Learning Conference, or they're interested in going to visiting Minnesota during the fall retreat. And one of the ways that we kind of weed out those students is through that application process. So using those rubrics to identify ways that students have highlighted their interest in the organizational goals as well as the YAC goals is one way that we kind of weigh out those cons of advertising those incentives for youth. So we did address the standard length. For us, it's 2 years. In the other previous councils that I've worked with, the school-based councils generally have a term of 1 year. The other nonprofits that I've worked with, they have a term of 1 year as well. But I think just allowing for that flexibility depending on the projects that your councils are focusing on is very helpful. And again, I will definitely share those rubrics to everyone following the webinar, and it will be available on the GSN as well as a link to a copy of this webinar. And then Hannah says that we have a large core of teen volunteers. Right now, the staff are only filters for choosing teens to be leaders through interviews. Other teams have asked that they have a role in picking who their leaders are each year. Any suggestions for doing this successfully and effectively? That's a great question, Hannah, and that's something that I also did not mention in our recruitment process for our own Youth Advisory Council. So we actually include our YAC mentors as a part of the recruitment process for selecting the new cohort of Youth Advisory Council members. So I would definitely encourage you to do the same with your group, having them, whether it's 1 or 2, depending on the size of your group, be a part of that recruitment process. And I did share that we have YAC mentors, and the YAC mentors are actually self-selected by their peers. So recognizing the leadership with your youth is extremely helpful. And I think going back to what we said about having that sound foundation of identifying your desired results, if you have all that information in advance, youth are very capable of following that information and really having a full understanding of it. And the same way that we would go through a formal training or overview with our staff at NYLC as to what we're hoping to reflect in our Youth Advisory Councils, our teens and our youth that we work with, we're going through that same process. So depending on where your teens are located, maybe that would be adjusting your meeting time so that they could join those meetings. So maybe meeting after 3, or providing an option for them to call in if it's a late night meeting or early morning meeting when they may be in school. I think it's important for you as a facilitator to make those adjustments that would allow those youth to join in that selection process. But it is something that NYLC does. It's something that we will continue to do, and it's something that has been very successful and helpful in not only recognizing the leadership that the youth can bring, but also giving them an option to select who they would like to serve with throughout their service terms. And Tony is sharing that one incentive for service learning is a transcript. Absolutely. So thinking about that demonstration aspect within that IPARD process, which is the student activities process, whether it's certificates or talking to your schools, school advisors or superintendents, to really recognize the experience that the students are having on their transcript is extremely helpful. So we require background checks for all adults, including the youth council participants over the age of 18. So we actually do not require background checks for our youth council participants over the age of 18. That's not something that we've come across as a best practice, although I would say that it's definitely worth looking into depending on the group of youth that you are working with. As a part of our background checks, we do require all adults, whether they're AmeriCorps members or staff members, to go through those background checks. And then on top of the background checks, we also require our drivers to complete a background check on their driving history to ensure that they have the right requirements to transport our youth when they are here locally. And then one question I'm hearing is, our teams select the leaders for the following year in the spring. They review applications and set up and do the interviews with adult guidance. They know their peers. Absolutely. Absolutely. Just using, again, the opportunities that your youth and the skills that your youth have to help select those peers with adult guidance. And perhaps it's just sharing some specific things that the students should be looking out for, whether it's background checks or particular leadership styles, or using those self-assessments and evaluations as a guide for their peers, but definitely leveraging the opportunity, the skills that the students have to help select their peers. And again, that could also be one of the projects that your council focuses on, and using that iProd model as a way to investigate like what is a great recruitment process for your group is also another learning opportunity that can help make that connection to addressing a genuine community need. Recognition at graduation, absolutely. I know Guilford County Schools in North Carolina does a great job of recognizing student experience in service learning at graduation on their high school diplomas and within their school transcripts. So if you're interested in learning more about what other districts have done around recognition for service learning, I would definitely reference you to Guilford County Schools in North Carolina. And then another statement that I'm seeing, it says that we also have the option of teams being appointed by the county board and the school board. 24 slots, they are seen as a commission within the county. And I think this is another example of how you can not only use youth within a council of youth, but also use youth in developing and connecting with other councils within your county or your school. At NYLC, we actually have 3 youth board members who serve on our youth advisory, on our executive board of directors, and those youth were pulled from our youth advisory council. So they served a term of 1 or 2 years with NYLC prior, and now will have the option to serve on our board of directors. And so that's another example of how you can leverage the skills and the talents of your youth advisory council members in other areas. And Saban, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name right, just gave another great example about having youth serve on county boards and school boards. And one of the things that I do in my role is ensuring that the youth who are serving on the youth advisory, on our executive board of directors, have the information available to them in advance as we would give them regarding their participation on our youth advisory council. And so connecting with the board chair to gather all that information, connecting with the NYLC staff liaison to the board to ensure that they complete the official onboarding process with the executive board is something that I do in my role. And then following their appointment to the board, I may provide some professional PD opportunities for those youth to ensure that their term with our board is extremely successful. And Tony's offering a lot of great ideas. Thank you, Tony. Are there any other questions that you'd like for us to answer now? And again, I will share my contact information at the end, so if you do have any questions afterwards, feel free to contact me. You're very welcome. Okay. So just a few additional resources for your benefit. Our Youth Advisory Council member also created a webinar in 2012, and so I'm providing that link to this webinar as well. And this webinar in particular goes into some of the smaller details. So thinking about the protocols that you would have when forming a council. I'm thinking about what are some ways that you can engage youth voice within your council. I definitely want to reference you to this webinar as a great way to not only learn about what NYLC has historically done, but also hear from our Youth Advisory Council members themselves. And Marcus actually just shared the link to that webinar. It's about 45 minutes or so. And then, again, if you have any questions about any future questions or further questions about forming a Youth Advisory Council member, a Youth Advisory Council, this webinar would be a great tool that really goes into details about the specific protocols that should be followed. And then mentioning back to that service learning process about identifying the desired results, the University of Minnesota Extension has a great link that talks about the quality within youth development programs. And so we've just shared this in the chat box as well, which will help you really identify what should be present in your programs, if it's something that you are currently still working on or have questions around or want to evaluate the work that you're doing as an organization or as a council itself. The University of Minnesota has a lot of great resources around identifying those positive youth development frameworks or key constructs or models, however you reference them. I would definitely suggest that you visit this website for more information about youth development background and program development. And then I've mentioned a few times the Generator School Network. This is NYLC's online service learning community. We are also sharing this link in the chat box. And this is the website that we as a national organization use with our Youth Advisory Council members to engage them remotely. We host a lot of webinars on this platform for our Youth Advisory Council members. This is where we store all the documents from our meeting notes to our workshop presentations, to our professional development opportunities. All of this is taking place on the GSN. It's our group, our Youth Advisory Council member, Youth Advisory Council has a page on this website, which will allow us to communicate privately amongst each other. And so this is another way that if your students are doing service learning projects, the GSN is a great website to learn more about service learning opportunities, to engage with other youth and other councils who are doing very similar work. But it's also a great way for you to keep reference and record of the information that you're doing throughout your service term with your youth. And then lastly, the National Service Learning Conference is taking place in DC in April 2015. December 31st is the deadline for the reduced registration fee. If you have not had the opportunity to come, I think this is a great avenue for you to not only learn more about service learning as well as best practices within youth development, but also a great leadership and professional development opportunity for your own Youth Advisory Council members. It's been participated by, I think last year the numbers were over 1,400 educators, 40% of which are youth. Youth take a large presence in the success of this conference. Youth serve as youth MCs, they serve as plenary speakers, they serve as workshop presenters. So again, if you have that within your budget, the National Service Learning Conference is a great opportunity for you to not only build professional development opportunities for your youth, but also highlight the success that you're doing within your programs and also connect with groups of students who are doing similar work for you, similar work with you. And this year, and actually 2015, is taking place in Washington, D.C., if I did not reference that earlier. Feel free to visit those websites for more information about any of those additional resources. One follow-up for me is to share the NYLC student recruitment as well as student application as well as rubric that we use to evaluate our Youth Advisory Council members. And to answer your question, Tony, the National Service Learning Conference is not always in DC. It just happens to be in DC for the next 2 years. Following that, it will be shifted to a different city, which I think is currently being confirmed by a conference and events team. In the past, has been in Minneapolis. We've been in Colorado. We've been in San Jose. We've been in Atlanta. We've been all over. It's just the focus of the organization has currently been based in DC for multiple reasons. So for the next 2 years, the conference is also going to be based there. That's great to hear, Tony. All right, so this is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me via email or phone. And again, I will share all this information with you following the webinar, as well as a few other resources based on some of the questions that we have. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Marcus is also available if you have any questions. Thank you for your time today. I do want to be mindful and respectful of your time and recognize that our planned allotment has now ended. But again, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you, everybody.